The eternal sleep. It was the year 1714, and on that night of October 14th, the first eerie winds whispered through the ancient oak trees of Windermere, a village long forgotten by time. In this remote corner of England, hidden deep within the mist-laden hills, the villagers had always known something was not quite right with the old manor at the edge of the forest. Known only by a forgotten name, the manor stood like a sentinel, its high arched windows dark and hollow, and its proud stone walls cloaked in vines which seemed to crawl of their own accord. This manor, the Hollowstead, was where tragedy had started, whispers of a restless soul that lit every night. In them lies an unexplained chill carried in the bones of anyone who dared to approach it. Edwin Cartwright is a young historian who's fascinated by local legends and ancient lore. He had just arrived in Windermere a few nights before the fateful night. He had read the tales of the Hollowstead in old manuscripts, heard about its forsaken beauty, and wondered about the long-forgotten secrets it held. His journey had been one of curiosity, seeking to uncover the truth about the manor's history, its former residents, and the mysterious deaths that had been linked to it over the centuries. As Edwin approached the village on that foggy October evening, the air seemed unusually heavy, thick with something he couldn't name. The path leading to the village was cloaked in an unnatural silence, the trees standing like dark sentinels against the dimming sky. The villagers, though few in number, eyed him cautiously, as if they knew more than they cared to say. Every glance made him shiver, but his resolution impelled him forward. He could not ignore the allure of the manor. The deeper he plunged into the investigation, the more he felt like something unseen was watching him. When he arrived at the village inn, the proprietor, a gray-haired woman named Mabel, gave him a wary look. "You're here about the manor, aren't you?" she asked without a hint of surprise. Her voice trembled as she spoke, as if the very mention of the Hollowstead was enough to draw the shadows closer. Edwin nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I've heard stories about its past and the strange events surrounding it. I'm hoping to uncover the truth." Mabel's face set, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke again. "Don't go there, young man. No one who ventures near that place ever comes back the same. They say the manor is cursed, haunted by the spirit of Lady Eveline." "Lady Eveline," Edwin repeated, fascinated. "Who was she?" Mabel hesitated, her hands clutching the edges of the counter. A woman of beauty, of grace, and tragedy. She was the last of the Cartwright family, the original owners of the Hollowstead. It's said she was driven mad by the deaths of her family. They died mysteriously one by one, and Lady Eveline, well, she vanished one stormy night. No one saw her leave, but when the dawn came, the manor was empty, except for her presence, lingering in the shadows. Edwin felt a shiver run down his spine as Mabel spoke, but his fascination only deepened. "Is there any truth to the tales? Did Lady Eveline die?" Mabel shook her head. "No one knows, but every year, on the same night, her ghost is said to return to the manor. The villagers, they speak of her whispers and the footsteps heard in the halls. Some even say she's still waiting, hoping someone will break the curse, or maybe imprison themselves within it." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if echoing the unease that filled the room. Edwin sat in silence, contemplating the weight of Mabel's words. There was more to this story than he had anticipated. He had come seeking history, but it seemed that Windermere's past was far darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Later that evening, after Mabel had retired to her quarters, Edwin could not shake the feeling that something was watching him. The inn, though warm and inviting, felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him as the shadows of night grew deeper. His mind raced with thoughts of the Hollowstead. It called to him, beckoning him to uncover its secrets, to explore the manor's dark rooms and halls, where the very air seemed thick with sorrow. At the stroke of midnight, Edwin could resist no longer. The wind had picked up, and fog was rising thick enough outside to shroud the village in an eerie silence. He steeled himself, put on his coat, and stepped out into the chill of the night. His footsteps rang through the deserted street as he went in the direction of the Hollowstead. The manor loomed before him as he approached, its towering silhouette casting long, twisted shadows that reached out to meet him. The rusty gate creaked on its hinges, either welcoming him or warning him to turn back. Edwin pushed forward, his heart pounding with both fear and excitement. As he walked through the gate, he felt that the air changed. It grew colder, the drop in temperature so sharp that he could see his breath, though the sky above him was cloudless. Fog swirled around his feet, as if it were alive and pulling him further into the manor's grounds. The front door of the Hollowstead stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for him. Edwin hesitated, but only for a moment. He stepped inside. At once was the smell, stale and stimy like dusts at dead man's halls in abandoned, forgotten places that hadn't passed at light's reach and touch for centuries. Now, the grand foyer still remained dark, though this particular scene had a single candle towards one far wall that flickered slightly where, though the rest of it looked to be dark as shadows, his footsteps would thump against the wooden floors because every sound echoed off with nothing around him. There was a feeling of being under surveillance. Edwin could feel it, an oppressive pressure, as if eyes were watching every move he made. Turning his back towards the sweeping staircase, its railing carved with intricate patterns, he felt he saw a figure standing at the top, watching him. Then he blinked, and the figure was gone. His breathing picked up as he kept walking, moving further into the core of the Hollowstead. He couldn't quite say why, but something in him called to the old library, the place where Lady Eveline spent a lot of her time. They say that she had kept a journal that contained the diary of her family's tragic demise. As he approached the library door, he sensed the strange silence that had fallen over the manor. Even the wind outside seemed to have stopped. He pushed the door open, and the room saluted him with an oppressive darkness. There were bookshelves lining the walls, some of which were filled with dust, and others completely empty. Old paper and leather filled his nostrils with a faint scent. Then he saw the journal lying on a table that was in the middle of the room. The pages were yellowed with age. He cautiously stepped closer, reaching out to touch the leather. Just as his fingers brushed the leather, a strong gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. Edwin spun around, heart racing, but the door was locked, and the room seemed to shrink, as if the walls were closing in. His fingers shook as he opened the journal. The first page was dated October 14th, 1671, the very same date that had brought him to Wintermere. However, the writings on the page were something he had never seen before in his life. "Tonight, I will sleep the eternal sleep, and with me, I will take my secrets to the grave." The words were chilling, scrawled across the page in a shaking hand, and as Edwin read them, he felt a chill creep down his spine. He heard something now, the faint whispers of distance growing loud enough, close enough, to step inside. He turned toward the door, but now the whispers came from all about him, the shadows that reached out to take him. And so, the curse began, as it had done so many times before. The Hollowstead had awakened once more. It was a silence unlike any Edwin had ever known. It wasn't the quiet of a sleeping house. It was the silence of a place where sound feared to linger, as if the manor itself held its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. He had entered the library seeking answers, but now that the shadows seemed to stretch farther and into the corners of the room, the weight of an invisible presence settled upon him. The journal in his hands felt strangely cold, its pages damp to the touch, as if it had just been used moments before. The words, written in Lady Eveline's delicate but trembling handwriting, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He couldn't tear his eyes away from them, but as he read the chilling entry about the eternal sleep, a shiver crawled down his spine. "Tonight, I shall sleep an eternal sleep, and with me to my grave carry all my secrets." What secrets could the woman from so long ago have left behind? And why was this journal here in the middle of the manor, waiting for him? Edwin's mind ran wild, but a sudden noise snapped him back. It was faint at first, a soft rustling from the far side of the room, almost as if someone or something was moving in the dark, just out of his reach. He froze, straining to hear, but the sound ended almost as quickly as it had begun. His breath caught in his throat. No windows existed in the library, no draft to explain the movement. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he felt his pulse quicken. The whispers returned, louder and clearer, yet still just out of understanding. It was as if the air itself was alive with the breath of the manor, carrying with it the voices of those who had lived and died here. Edwin looked around, his eyes roving across the shelves that lined the walls. Books not seen for millennia now appeared to be looking at him, their worn spines like mute sentinels. He went forward with a slow step toward the corner of the room where an ornate mirror hung, tarnished with age. The edges darkened, as if the mirror had absorbed all the years of sorrow and madness flowing through these halls. As Edwin approached the mirror, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow flickering just at the edge of his vision. He whipped around, but the room was empty. His breath was shallow, his heart thundering in his chest. Something was wrong. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The manor wasn't just abandoned, it was alive in ways he couldn't understand. Now the journal, still in his hands, seemed heavier, urging him forward, pushing him for more. He glanced back at the mirror with a fleeting look at the tarnished surface. For a moment he thought he saw something, or maybe someone, reflected in it, a figure standing just behind him. He turned, but there was no one. The draft carried a chill of earthy decomposition into the room. Door to the library, hitherto firmly shut, slowly creaked its way open as if a remote control had been used to manipulate this physical effort. The air in the hallway beyond seemed thick. It was as if the manor itself was waiting breathlessly to see what he would do. Edwin knew he could turn back, leave the manor, and go back to the village, to safety. But something inside him was urging him to continue. The journal, the whispers, the shadows were all part of something much bigger than he had imagined. A part of him, the part that had been driven by curiosity and an insatiable desire to understand the past, could not turn away now. With a deep breath, he stepped toward the door. In that moment when his foot crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped further. His breath came out in visible puffs, and weight seared in on him from all sides. The weight of the manor. The hallway was narrow and lined with faded portraits, which seemed to watch him as he passed. Their eyes in the painting were lifelike, something that was unnerving because it seemed they monitored his every action. Their intention fixed on him created an unpleasant dryness to his skin. At the end of the hall, a door swung slightly open. He hadn't noticed it before. The whispering grew more urgent, more insistent, pulling him across to the door. Edwin stepped softly across the thick carpet and pushed the door open. Inside was very dark. Then Edwin felt that dim flicker coming from the far corner, so it appeared quite weird, greenish and a little twisted against the wall. He noticed this very big four-poster bed inside, enclosed with very heavy curtains, but this man sat right at the side of it, turned in some distance away from Edwin's eye. It was a woman, wrapped in dark, flowing robes, her long black hair cascading down her back. She was still, unnaturally so, as if frozen in place. Edwin's breath caught in his throat. Could it be Lady Aveline herself? Was she here, waiting for him? He stepped forward cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to turn and flee, but his feet moved of their own accord. He reached out toward the figure, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers brushed her shoulder, the woman spun around, her eyes wide with terror, her face pale and gaunt, as though the very life had been drained from her. Edwin jerked back, his heart pounding. The woman's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, but the words were overwhelmed by the growing whispers around him. The temperature in the room dropped, and Edwin could see his breath fogging in the air. A cold shroud wrapped around him like a vice, and the woman's form began to blur, dissolving into mist. With a scream, Edwin stumbled backward, his eyes darting around the room. Shadows were closing in on him, swirling together as if they were alive. He reached for the door but slammed it shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. Darkness deepened, the greenish light flickering and dying, leaving him complete darkness. Then there was the voice from soft and chilling, fading into a distance. "You cannot escape. You never will." Edwin's heart thudded in his chest as he fumbled for the door. His fingers touched the cold wooden surface, but it was useless. The shadows were closing in. The whispers grew louder, and the temperature continued to drop. He was no longer alone in the room. Something was there with him, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the floor beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though the manor itself was shifting, realigning to trap him in its dark embrace. Suddenly, everything was quiet. Edwin gasped for air, his body shaking as he opened his eyes. He was no longer in the dark room. He stood in the library again, the journal still clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced. Had it been a vision? A hallucination? Or had the manor truly pulled him into another realm where the lines between the living and the dead were blurred? The whispers returned, but they were no longer distant. They were close, so close that Edwin could feel the breath of the unseen watchers on the back of his neck. His heart pounded as he glanced around, and in the dim candlelight, he saw something, or someone, standing in the doorway. Taller than the tallest tree there, the figure was cloaked in shadow with its face hidden from view. But of those eyes that glowed so eerily, there was something truthful revealed. He was not leaving the Hollowstead alive. The darkness that surrounded Edwin in the Hollowstead was not of light. It was something far more sinister and full that had filled all the crevices within the manor, seeped into its walls, floors, and into his very bones. He thought that the whispers were an illusion, some creation of a mind worn by the strain of a mystery, but they were true. They were as real as the searing cold that had settled about him, and as real as the growing sense of dread that gnawed at him from the inside out. After what felt like an eternity in the library with the shadowy figure just outside the door, Edwin knew he had to move. These weren't just whispers in his mind. They were substantial. They represented the voices of the past, ancient and trapped in this place that called out to him to warn or lead him deeper into their web of terror. He had pulled himself out of the library, but when he left the room, his life seemed to change. The manor seemed to shut in upon him, each step seeming heavier, as if the floor was sucking at him to make him stay. The air grew colder, more suffocating with each passing second. Even the walls were alive, watching and waiting. Edwin's heart thudded in his chest as he walked down the narrow corridor. The soft creak of the floorboards under his feet broke the thick silence. Portraits along the walls seemed to leer at him, their painted eyes following each movement of his. He could feel their judgment, their condemnation. He wasn't meant to be here. The Hollowstead was no place for the living. It is a tomb, a forgotten relic of a time long past, and he's intruding. As he walked further down the corridor, the house seemed to press in upon him. The walls closed in, and the shadows deepened, becoming thick and unnatural. He could feel them pushing against him, tugging at the edges of his sanity, urging him to look back, to flee before it was too late. But he couldn't. He couldn't leave without uncovering the truth. He had gone too far. At the end of the hallway stood yet another door, this one unlike any of the others. This door was ancient, weathered, and had a design carved into the wood so strange and intricate that one could imagine it was crafted by hands that no longer existed. It was slightly ajar, and a faint, eerie light seeped from the crack. It was dim, flickering like the last breath of a dying flame, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. Edwin hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. The moment his hand touched the cold brass handle, a jolt of energy shot through his body like a current of electricity. He recoiled, but the door swung open of its own accord, revealing the room beyond. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but something else clung to the room. A feeling of sadness, of loss, hung in the stale air. The walls were lined with shelves of old, tattered books, their spines cracked and faded with age. The room was small, but the oppressive weight of the silence made it feel like a cavern. Going farther in the room, he came upon an enormous fireplace which stood cold and dark. Above it, a large, tarnished mirror hung, its surface covered in grime. But what caught Edwin's eyes was a figure standing before the mirror, a woman. She was tall and thin. Her dark hair cascaded down her back in a tangled mass. Standing motionless before the mirror, staring at herself with a vacant, hollow expression, as if lost in some other world altogether. She was uncannily beautiful, almost otherworldly, as if from another age, a phantom of some old, forgotten epoch. Her clothes were ragged and old, but there was something both eerie and familiar about her. Edwin felt his throat constrict, unease wash over him. He did not want to go near her, but he could not stay in the room, nor away from the mirror. He trudged forward, his feet seemingly lugged like concrete. The air cooled to biting him as he approached. It was so cold he could see his breath steaming in front of him. The woman did not seem to notice him at all as her gaze remained on the mirror. It had almost been expressionless on the face of her otherwise bland features. She had appeared more an ornament of the manor than a living human who had ever left its grounds. When Edwin was barely a few feet away, the whispering returned, louder now, around him like a swarm of angry bees. The words were indistinguishable, but the urgency in the voice was palpable. "Don't look into the glass." The warning was crystal clear, but it was already too late. His eyes were now drawn to the mirror, to the woman staring back at him from its reflection. But it was not her own picture that he saw there. The glass shimmered, waves across its surface like across a stretch of water, and from the depths another landscape, a view of Hollowstead, but not of a home. This was animate, ablaze with light, hectic activity. Figures flitted across a laughing and talking crowd, but nary a one looked that he had been seen. As Edwin looked deeper into the glass, a face began to emerge from the reflections. A face twisted in pain, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. It was the face of a man, but it was not one Edwin recognized. The image flickered, distorting as though something was trying to break free from the mirror's surface. And suddenly the woman spoke, a voice soft and hollow, as if it came from somewhere far beyond time and space. "You should never have come here." Edwin stumbled backward, heart racing. The mirror seemed to throb dark energy, and the whispering grew louder, louder until a deafening crescendo arose. The face in reflection contorted in pain and reached out to him, its hands pounded on glass. And then, at a moment of clear horror, Edwin realized something. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a portal, a door to something else, something old and evil. He didn't think. He turned and ran from the room, his footsteps echoing off the empty halls as he sprinted back toward the stairs. The whispers followed him, their voices now a cacophony in his head, drowning out all else. The manor closed in on him, its walls shifting, warping, as if it were alive, feeding on his fear. He climbed the stairs with ragged gasps for breath. The air seemed to grow colder each step he took, and the long shadows on the walls curved and twisted, reaching him like claws. He had the feeling of something pursuing him, but when he turned to look back, there was nothing. Before him lay the dark abyss that opened down into the hallway at the top of the stairs. He could hear now the sound of footsteps, first faint, but growing closer, louder. He wasn't alone. There was somebody, or something, with him in the house. Edwin turned to his right and went into the first door he saw. The room was empty, except for a large, old-fashioned writing desk in the center, its surface cluttered with papers, ink pots, and a quill. The windows were covered with heavy drapes, blocking out the light. He moved toward the desk, his hands shaking as he rifled through the papers, desperate for something, anything, that could explain what was happening to him. But as his fingers touched the stack of papers, something odd happened. The whispers, the maddening, ancient voices, grew louder, more frantic. And then, one by one, the papers on the desk began to move. They fluttered as if caught in an unseen breeze, swirling around him like leaves caught in the wind. He reached out to stop them, but his hand passed right through the papers, as if they were made of smoke. The door behind him slammed shut, and the temperature of the room plummeted even further. A shadow moved across the floor, stretching across the walls, and Edwin turned, his heart in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood. The figure did not move, but Edwin could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. The whispers were all around him now, louder than ever, and in the center of them, a single voice rose above the rest, a voice filled with malevolent intent. "You will never leave." Edwin's blood ran cold as the figure advanced a step. The door behind him was shut, and the window, as everything else in the Hollowstead, sealed over, imprisoning him in this macabre. There was no place to go, and in that moment, he realized with growing horror, the manor had already claimed him. It had claimed his soul the moment he entered, and now there was no escape. The eternal sleep was not just a curse, it was his destiny. Edwin's pulse quickened, stumbling back away from the silhouette of the man in the doorway. His mind howled to him to turn and flee, but his legs seemed heavy with leaden massiveness, fixed by terror of its own self. Darkness welled inside the room, he could have sworn. It grew to wrap itself around all sides and engulf him alive. Thick fog breathed upon him through icy lace curtains like an unfathomable cloak of frost-covered sadness and anguish. The figure in the doorway did not budge, but its presence filled the space, as if it had always been there, waiting for him. The whispers that had been following him throughout the house now grew louder, sharper, almost tangible, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. Edwin could hear fragments of words. Leave, the price, forever. But it was already too late. The manor had already called him to it. It had made a choice as to him being its next victim and soul to fall into this eternal sleep. He tried to turn his eyes away from the figure, but he couldn't hold it for long. Something about its presence, its silence, made his body shudder, urging him to step closer, to confront it. The shadows seemed to stretch around him, growing longer, and Edwin felt them tug at his skin, pulling him toward the figure like a magnet. He struggled, but it was no use. He couldn't escape. He turned his back to the figure, letting the chill of the room sink into his bones. He walked fast, but unbalanced, as if something were pulling him back. But the door behind him was locked. Another trap, another bar that held him within the clutches of this accursed place. His trembling hands tried a window, sealed shut with cold, unforgiving iron bars. What was once filled with furniture gone old and memories faded, now seemed to close in on him like a tomb ready to swallow him whole. The whispers became frantic now, as he heard their words seep into his mind like the winding of snakes through his thoughts. It is not over. The price. Too late to leave. Edwin pressed his hands against his ears, but nothing stopped the voices. They pounded inside his skull, ceaseless and maddening. He felt his sanity slipping away with every passing second, the edges of his mind unraveling like the tattered curtains in the room. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the racket stopped. The silence was complete, oppressive, heavy enough to cling to the air. Edwin opened his eyes gradually, fearing what he would see, but he was not able to. In the room around him, the figure in the doorway was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, Edwin dared to hope. Maybe, he thought, it had simply been his imagination, one of those tricks of shadow. But deep down in his gut, he knew what was true. He could feel this gnawing certainty that the entity that was there, whatever this thing was watching and waiting. He turned to the desk, his eyes going to the pile of papers he had attempted to read. They were still there, their edges curling a little from the moisture in the air. The quill lay untouched, as though no time had passed. But something was different. Words on the papers had changed. Ink shifted, as though written by unseen hands. He approached slowly, his fingers feeling the brittle parchment. Words danced before his eyes, shifting and morphing into sentences that he could not understand. It was as if he would go mad reading them. But still, he could not tear his eyes away. The price must be paid in full. You cannot escape. The Hollowstead never lets go. The words burned into his mind like a brand. The Hollowstead never lets go. What did that mean? Was it the manor itself speaking to him? Or was it something more, a force beyond time and space that had claimed this place long ago? The horror struck Edwin in the thought. His blood ran ice cold. Was it that it had never been a home, the Hollowstead, but rather a prison? Perhaps it was a vessel for something much older and inherently far more evil than he could conceive. Before he could dwell on the thought any longer, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, sending a jolt of panic through his body. He turned, heart pounding, to see the figure standing in the doorway once more, its form outlined in shadow. This time, however, it wasn't alone. Behind the figure, a great swirling darkness had begun to pool, as if the air itself had turned to liquid night. The floor beneath Edwin's feet seemed to tremble, as though the house were alive, its foundations shaking with the weight of an unseen presence. The whispers returned, now a low, guttural hum, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, too low to distinguish, but heavy with the promise of something terrible. He could feel the temperature drop even further, his breath coming out in visible clouds. The cold continued to seep into his skin, freezing his insides. His limbs felt stiff, as though they were in some tight binding, held in place by an invisible hand. His heart hammered in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. Whispers escalated now into an unbearable crescendo, and then, without warning, the world around him seemed to explode in a burst of blinding light. Edwin staggered back, shielding his eyes from the blinding brightness. When he opened them again, the room had changed. The ordinary manor walls were gone, at least anything remotely ordinary about them. He was not in the room with the desk and the mirror. Instead, he stood in an empty, desolate landscape. The ground beneath him was cracked and barren, as though it had been scorched by some long-forgotten fire. Above the sky was a sickly shade of red, full of clouds that seemed to be moving in unnatural patterns. Far off into the distance, he could make out the outlines of twisted, gnarled trees whose limbs were contorted into grotesque shapes. A chill ran down Edwin's spine as he realized the truth. This was no longer the Hollowstead. This was something else entirely. Another realm. A place beyond death and life, where time had no meaning and reality was but a fragile illusion. The whispers had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was the silence of a place abandoned by hope, a place where souls were trapped forever, doomed to wander in darkness. Edwin's body shook, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each breath he took. He could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on him, something that had existed long before the Hollowstead, long before he had even been born. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. This was nothing like the shadowy form he had seen in the manor. This was different. Tall, skeletal, with tattered robes streaming behind him in the wind like moth wings. The body draped over itself, faceless under its hood. And Edwin felt those eyes upon him, cold, unblinking, staring right through to his very soul. He raised a bony hand, and Edwin was suddenly overwhelmed with a desire to approach. His body began moving against his will, his feet dragging on the cracked earth as if it were being compelled by an unseen force. He wanted to stop, turn around, flee. It was impossible. The pull was too strong. The figure spoke then, its voice hollow and echoing, sounding like it was being reverberated through Edwin's very bones. "You have entered the realm of the forgotten," it said, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "And now, you are one of us. The Hollowstead never lets go." Edwin wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The figure's hand reached out, and with it, the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Edwin felt it, all of it, the overwhelming sense that something was about to snap, that the fine line between reality and nightmare had almost disappeared. All that went through his jumbled head was confusion, fright, and a deep, gnawing feeling of inevitability. He had entered a far darker world than he could imagine. Hollowstead was not only a house, nor simply a cursed place. Hollowstead was alive, and it claimed him, body and soul. The skeletal figure was looming before him, its presence as heavy as the suffocating air. Edwin had no choice but to follow, his body moving with a mind of its own, his feet dragging across the cracked ground of this desolate realm. Darkness stretched on all sides, endless and consuming. The silence was unbearable, except that the faintest whisper of the wind filled it, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten memories over centuries. As Edwin drew closer to the silhouette, his mind couldn't catch up with the immensity of the situation. He was trapped. He had no other choice. There could be no return to his old life, no escape from this world. The Hollowstead took it all from him, the house, the memories, and even his identity. And now it demanded the last price. The bony hand rose again, and Edwin felt the weight of its gaze, though its face was lost in shadow. The air around him seemed to thicken, as if the very fabric of the world was folding in on itself. Time had no meaning here. Moments stretched and warped in ways that defied understanding. His grip on reality was loosening, being overtaken by a creeping sense of dread that threatened to engulf him whole. "You cannot leave," the figure said, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves, cold and unforgiving. "This is your fate, Edwin. You have crossed the threshold, and now you must pay the price." Edwin wanted to shout, to ask questions. However, the words got stuck inside his throat. It felt like his voice had been taken away, replaced with the oppressive weight of silence. He had no option but to listen, undergo the haunting words of the figure. "The Hollowstead claims all who enter," the figure continued. "Those who seek its secrets are never permitted to leave. You are bound to it as they all were, and now you are one of us trapped in the eternal sleep." A wave of nausea washed over Edwin, his knees buckling beneath him as he struggled to stay upright. The words of the figure were like poison. Each syllable sank deeper into his soul. His mind raced with desperation, trying to understand, trying to find some way to break free. But there was nothing, no escape, no salvation. "You will never awaken," the figure intoned, its voice colder than the grave. "Your soul will remain here, trapped in this place for eternity. You will never see the light of day again. You will be lost in the shadows, forgotten by time itself." Edwin's heart was pounding against his chest. The frantic, unremitting rhythm threatened to rip him apart. He could feel the fear physically pushing down on him from all sides. His vision started blurring as the edges of his perception began to warp and the darkness closed in. Then, the earth shook beneath him. A growling rumbled through the air, deep and low, resonating through his bones. The figure stepped forward, shifting and morphing, turning an increasingly monstrous shape with every passing second. A hand stretched out, long and clawed like the talon of some ancient creature. Edwin stumbled back, but it was too late. He was captured, ensnared by the web of the curse of Hollowstead. He felt a grip close tightly around his wrist. Touch was like ice and relentless. The shock of pain shook his entire body, and for this 1 second, opened before him flashes from the past. His old life before everything that could be remembered before Manor and after endless night. He envisioned his family, home, and sunlight's warmth. But it was fleeting, a dream that dispersed at dawn. "You are already forgotten," the figure whispered, its voice now a hissing, rasping sound echoing in the empty expanse. "And soon, your name will fade from memory. You will be lost, just as they were." Terror coursed through Edwin's veins as he struggled against the figure's grip, but it was useless. He was powerless, just another soul for the Hollowstead to consume. Darkness thickened around him, tendrils creeping up his legs, grasping his body, pulling him down into the abyss. He could hear only the faintest sounds, the whispering voices of the other lost souls who had long preceded him. They remained here, caught in one endless cycle of torment and despair, the Hollowstead claiming them all, piece by piece. And now there was his turn. But there was something else, something beneath the surface of the fear. A flicker of defiance, a whisper of resistance. He was not ready to give up, not yet. There had to be a way out. There had to be something he could do. The figure gripped the figure tighter, and Edwin's vision was turning darker, his thoughts all foggy. Just at that moment, however, something inside him shifted. Something sparked clear in his brain. He was not helpless. Hollowstead was not God. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Edwin wrenched his arm free from the figure's grasp. The world around him trembled, the very foundation of the realm shaking as he stood, defiant in the face of the darkness. "I will not be a part of this," he whispered through clenched teeth, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I will not be forgotten." For a brief moment, the figure paused, its twisted form flickering like a dying flame. The air grew still, and the whispers that had plagued him fell silent. Edwin's heart raced in his chest as he felt the weight of the Hollowstead's curse lift, just for a moment, like a breath of fresh air in a long-forgotten world. But it was not enough. The darkness boiled forward again, more violent than before, more powerful than anything he had ever known. Edwin's vision blurred as the weight of the realm pressed in upon him, forcing him to the brink of unconsciousness. He could feel himself slipping, losing his grip on reality. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, the world went black,